On the morning of April 17th, 1945, the sun rose pale and uncertain over a sprawling processing camp near the town of Halle in central Germany. The air carried the scent of damp earth and diesel fuel, mingling with the distant rumble of transport trucks arriving in steady convoys. Corporal Marcus Thompson stood at the edge of a muddy clearing, watching as another column of prisoners filed through the main gate, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. He had been stationed at this facility for only 3 weeks, but already he had processed more than 4,000 individuals, each one carrying a story he would never fully know. The women in this particular column moved with a weariness that seemed to weigh on their very bones. They ranged in age from what appeared to be 16 to perhaps 60, wearing an assortment of military auxiliary uniforms, civilian clothes hastily thrown together, and in some cases, the remnants of communications corps attire. These were not combatants in the traditional sense. They were telephone operators, clerks, nurses, and administrative workers who had served the German military apparatus in various capacities. Now they were prisoners of war, subject to the protocols and procedures of an American army they had been taught to fear and despise. What none of these women could have anticipated, as they shuffled through the gates into American custody, was that their preconceptions about their captors were about to be shattered in ways they would remember for the rest of their lives. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how a single meal, served by men who had faced prejudice on both sides of the Atlantic, became an unexpected bridge between former enemies and challenged everything these German women had been told about America, about race, and about humanity itself. What began as a routine feeding operation at a prisoner processing center would transform into one of the most quietly remarkable moments of cultural collision in the entire conflict, leaving marks on hearts and minds that would persist for decades after the last truck had departed and the camp had returned to silence. Marcus Thompson had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, in a neighborhood where the boundaries of possibility were drawn as clearly as the lines on a map. His father worked at the Schloss furnaces, coming home each evening covered in soot and sweat, his hands calloused from labor that paid barely enough to keep the family fed. His mother took in washing from white families across town, spending her days bent over a scrub board, while Marcus and his 3 siblings helped hang the clothes to dry in their small backyard. Education was prized in the Thompson household as the one ladder that might lift the children above the circumstances of their birth, and Marcus had been a diligent student, graduating from Parker High School in 1941 with honors in mathematics and English composition. When the war came, Marcus had initially hoped to serve in a capacity that would use his education. He had heard about the Army Air Forces and the need for navigators and bombardiers, positions that required precisely the kind of mathematical aptitude he possessed. But the military of 1942 had other plans for young black men from Alabama. After basic training at Fort McClellan, Marcus found himself assigned to a quartermaster battalion, one of the segregated service units that would handle the unglamorous but essential work of keeping the fighting forces supplied. He learned to drive trucks, manage inventory, set up field kitchens, and process supplies through a distribution system that stretched from ports to front lines. He had arrived in Europe in the autumn of 1944, landing at a beach in France that still bore the scars of the invasion 4 months earlier. From there, his unit had followed the advancing armies eastward, always a few miles behind the front lines, setting up supply points and feeding stations wherever they were needed. He had served in France, Belgium, and now Germany, watching the war win toward its conclusion from a perspective that was simultaneously essential and invisible. The men who did the fighting received the glory and the recognition. The men who kept them fed and equipped received little more than the satisfaction of a job well done. Now Marcus stood in a processing camp that had been established in the gymnasium of what had once been a teacher training college. The building itself was an impressive structure of red brick and tall windows, though many of those windows were now cracked or missing entirely. Inside, the main hall had been converted into a registration area where prisoners were photographed, documented, and assigned to holding sections based on their former roles and potential intelligence value. Adjacent buildings served as temporary barracks, medical facilities, and the mess hall where Marcus and his fellow soldiers of the 451st Quartermaster Battalion prepared and served meals to the thousands of prisoners who passed through each week. The 451st was an all-black unit commanded by white officers, a typical arrangement in the segregated army of that era. Their commanding officer, Captain William Hendricks, was a career military man from Ohio who ran the unit with efficiency, if not warmth. He had made clear from the beginning that his primary concern was getting the job done correctly, and as long as his men performed their duties to standard, he would keep the higher command off their backs. This was about as much as black soldiers could hope for in 1945, and Marcus had learned to appreciate the captain's practical approach, even if it came without any particular affection. On this April morning, Marcus was assigned to the serving line in the mess hall, along with Private First Class Jerome Williams from Chicago, Private Delbert Hayes from rural Georgia, and Corporal Samuel Jackson from Philadelphia. The four men had become something like friends over the months of shared service, their different backgrounds gradually blending into a common identity forged by the unique circumstances of their situation. They were Americans serving their country in a war against tyranny, yet they came from a nation that denied them basic rights of citizenship. They were liberators bringing freedom to Europe, yet they served in an army that kept them separate and unequal. These contradictions had been the subject of many late-night conversations in their tent, discussions that swung between anger and hope, cynicism and determination. The mess hall kitchen was a marvel of military efficiency. 3 field ranges, each capable of producing 500 meals per hour, stood in a row against one wall. Stacked nearby were cases of canned vegetables, powdered eggs, dehydrated potatoes, and other staples of army cooking. But the real treasures were stored in a separate supply room that Marcus had helped inventory the previous day. Somehow their battalion had received a shipment that was unusual even by the improving standards of late-war supply chains. There were cases of ground beef, fresh buns, condiments including ketchup and mustard, and most remarkably, several crates of Coca-Cola in the distinctive green glass bottles that had become a symbol of American plenty. The battalion cook, Sergeant Roosevelt Franklin, had immediately recognized the opportunity. Franklin was a former short-order cook from Detroit who had worked at a diner near the Ford Rouge plant, feeding auto workers on their breaks with speed and skill. He had brought that expertise to the Army, becoming one of those invaluable specialists who could make decent meals from the most unpromising ingredients, but give him actual quality supplies, and Franklin could work something approaching magic. He had proposed to Captain Hendricks that they use the ground beef to make hamburgers for the prisoners, a suggestion that the captain had approved with a shrug, and a reminder that the Geneva Conventions required adequate feeding of prisoners regardless of the menu. What the captain may not have fully appreciated, and what Marcus himself was only beginning to understand, was the symbolic weight of what they were about to serve. Hamburgers and Coca-Cola were not just food and drink, they were icons of American culture, representations of a way of life that had been demonized in German propaganda for years. To serve these items to German prisoners was to offer them a direct taste of the enemy they had been taught to hate and fear. And to have that food served by black American soldiers was to confront them with a reality that contradicted everything the German regime had told them about race and American society. Marcus had heard about German racial ideology, of course. Everyone in the unit had. The Germans had built their entire war effort on a foundation of racial superiority, classifying peoples into hierarchies with themselves at the top and others arrayed below, in descending order of supposed worth. Black people occupied a particularly low rung in this classification, depicted in propaganda as primitive, dangerous, and subhuman. German soldiers had been told that black American troops were savages who would commit terrible atrocities against any Germans they captured, especially women. This propaganda had been so pervasive and so persistent that it had become an article of faith among many German civilians and military personnel. The women now filing into the mess hall had been raised on this propaganda. They had absorbed it through newspapers, radio broadcasts, films, posters, and the casual conversation of daily life. Many of them had never actually seen a black person before their capture. Their images of African Americans formed entirely by the grotesque caricatures of German media. Now they were about to sit down and receive a meal from the very people they had been taught to view as less than human. Marcus could see the fear in their eyes as they entered, the way they clustered together and avoided looking directly at the black soldiers behind the serving line. Some of the younger women were visibly trembling. Jerome Williams noticed it too. He was a sharp observer of human behavior, a skill he had developed growing up on the south side of Chicago, where reading people correctly could mean the difference between safety and danger. He leaned toward Marcus and spoke in a low voice. "They look like they expect us to eat them," he said. "You see how they're shaking. What do you think they were told about us?" Marcus nodded. "Probably nothing good, but we're going to show them different. That's all we can do." The serving process began. The women formed into lines with the automatic obedience of people accustomed to military discipline, collecting metal trays and moving toward the stations where food was being distributed. First came the hamburgers, assembled by Sergeant Franklin and his kitchen crew and kept warm in covered containers. Each prisoner received one hamburger on a regulation army tray, followed by a scoop of canned peas, a portion of the reconstituted mashed potatoes, and a small serving of canned peaches for dessert. At the end of the line stood a tub filled with ice and bottles of Coca-Cola, and each prisoner was handed one of the precious bottles as they completed their passage through the serving area. Marcus was stationed at the hamburger distribution point. His job was to place one hamburger on each tray as it passed before him, a simple mechanical task that required no particular skill. But he found himself paying attention to the faces of the women as they approached, trying to read their expressions and understand what they were experiencing. Most of them kept their eyes down, refusing to meet his gaze, accepting the food with a murmured word that might have been thanks and moving quickly on. But some of them looked up, and in those brief moments of eye contact, Marcus saw a range of emotions that was difficult to interpret. Fear, certainly, but also confusion, curiosity, and in some cases what appeared to be shame. One woman in particular caught his attention. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with light brown hair pinned back from a thin, tired face. Her uniform identified her as a former member of the Communications Auxiliary, probably a telephone operator or radio dispatcher. She approached Marcus's station with her tray held out before her, her hands visibly trembling. When Marcus placed the hamburger on her tray, she looked up at him, and for a moment, their eyes met. Marcus saw fear in her gaze, but also something else, a kind of desperate questioning, as if she were trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she had been told to expect. Marcus gave her a small nod and a slight smile. Nothing dramatic, just an acknowledgement of their shared humanity. The woman's eyes widened slightly, and then she was past, moving on to the next station. The scene repeated itself hundreds of times over the following hours, as the mess hall processed wave after wave of prisoners. Marcus served hamburgers until his arm ached from the repetitive motion, watching the faces pass before him in an endless stream. The women's reactions varied widely. Some remained terrified throughout, practically running from the serving line once their trays were filled. Others began to relax slightly as the meal progressed without incident, their rigid postures softening as they realized they were not about to be harmed. A few seemed to be studying the black soldiers with genuine curiosity, as if trying to fit these polite, efficient men into the mental categories they had been given. The first real breakthrough came about 2 hours into the serving operation. A young woman, perhaps 18 or 19 years old, reached the end of the line and was handed her Coca-Cola by Private Hayes. She looked at the bottle in confusion, clearly having no idea what it was. Hayes noticed her puzzlement and, with a gentle smile, mimed the motion of drinking. The young woman understood and raised the bottle to her lips, taking a tentative sip. Her eyes went wide with surprise at the sweet, fizzy taste, and despite herself she smiled. It was a small smile, quickly suppressed, but it was the first genuine smile any of the soldiers had seen from any of the prisoners. Hayes saw it and grinned back. "Good, isn't it?" he said, knowing she probably did not understand English, but wanting to acknowledge the moment. The young woman ducked her head, embarrassed at having shown pleasure in front of her captors, and hurried away to find a seat. But something had shifted in the atmosphere of the mess hall. Other women had seen the exchange, had witnessed one of their own smiling, while receiving food from a black American soldier. The fortress of propaganda and fear had developed its first small crack. The cracking continued throughout the meal. Conversations began to break out among the prisoners as they ate, low and cautious at first, but gradually increasing in volume and animation. Marcus could not understand the German words, but he could read the tones and gestures. The women were talking about the food. They were expressing surprise at its quality and quantity, and they were clearly discussing the soldiers who had served it to them, glancing toward the serving line, and then leaning together to whisper observations and reactions. Sergeant Franklin walked among the tables at one point, ostensibly to check that everything was proceeding smoothly, but also, Marcus suspected, to gauge the reception of his cooking. Franklin took pride in his work, and even in these strange circumstances, he wanted to know if his hamburgers were a success. The reactions he observed seemed to please him. The women were eating with evident appetite, some of them finishing their hamburgers faster than they had probably intended, and then looking almost embarrassed at their own hunger. The Coca-Cola bottles were being drained and examined, the women turning them over in their hands and studying the embossed lettering with curiosity. One woman actually caught Franklin's sleeve as he passed. She was older than most of the others, perhaps in her 50s, with grey streaking her dark hair and a face that bore the lines of hard experience. She spoke to Franklin in German, her tone earnest and emphatic. Franklin, of course, understood nothing, but he stopped and listened politely, nodding as if he followed every word. When the woman finished, Franklin smiled and patted her hand gently. "You're welcome, ma'am," he said. "I hope it tasted all right." The woman seemed to understand the sentiment, if not the words, and she nodded back, her eyes glistening with what might have been tears. Marcus watched this exchange from across the room, feeling something shift inside his own chest. He had come to Germany as a soldier, prepared to do his duty and nothing more. He had expected to feel anger toward the Germans, or at least a cold satisfaction at their defeat. These were the people who had started the war, who had followed a regime built on hatred and conquest, who had been taught to view people like Marcus as subhuman. He had every reason to treat them with indifference or contempt. But standing here, watching these frightened, hungry women eat the food he had served them, Marcus found that he could not sustain those feelings. What he felt instead was something more complicated, a mixture of pity and hope, and a strange sense of connection that he had not anticipated. The afternoon brought a new development. Captain Hendricks appeared in the mess hall with a clipboard and a purposeful expression, accompanied by a young woman in a slightly different uniform than the others. She turned out to be a translator, a German prisoner, who had been identified as fluent in English and pressed into service to facilitate communication between the American staff and the new arrivals. Her name was Ingrid Becker, and she looked nervous but determined, clearly understanding that cooperation was her best path to favorable treatment. Hendricks announced that he wanted to conduct informal interviews with some of the prisoners, getting basic information about their backgrounds and former duties. This was standard procedure for new arrivals, part of the sorting process that would determine where each prisoner was ultimately sent. But Hendricks had also noted the unusual atmosphere in the mess hall and wanted to understand what the prisoners were thinking and feeling. Marcus was not sure if this was official intelligence gathering or personal curiosity, but either way, it would provide an opportunity to hear directly from the women they had been feeding. The captain selected a table at random and sat down across from 3 prisoners, with Ingrid standing beside him to translate. Marcus found a reason to work nearby, wiping down tables that did not need wiping and restocking supplies that were already fully stocked, positioning himself close enough to overhear the conversation. The 3 women at the table were young, probably in their early 20s, and they looked terrified at being singled out by the American officer. Hendricks began with routine questions: name, rank, unit, duties. The women answered through Ingrid, providing the basic biographical information that would go into their files. But then Hendricks shifted to different territory. "Ask them what they think of the food," he instructed Ingrid. "Ask them if they were surprised by anything." Ingrid relayed the question, and the 3 women exchanged glances before one of them, a blonde with sharp features and watchful eyes, answered. Ingrid translated. She says the food is very good, better than she expected. She says she was told that American rations were poor quality, but this is not what she is experiencing. Hendricks nodded. What else surprises her? Another exchange in German, longer this time, with all three women contributing. Ingrid listened, her expression shifting through several emotions before she turned back to Hendricks. They say they are surprised by the black soldiers, she said carefully. They were told that black Americans were dangerous and would harm German prisoners, especially women. They were very frightened when they arrived and saw who would be guarding and feeding them. But they say the soldiers have been correct and respectful. They do not understand it. It is not what they were told to expect. Hendricks absorbed this without visible reaction. Tell them that American soldiers follow rules of conduct, regardless of their race. Tell them that the men serving their food are professionals doing their duty, and they have no reason to fear mistreatment. Ingrid translated this, and the women listened with expressions that mixed relief with lingering uncertainty. The blonde woman spoke again, and Ingrid turned to Hendricks with what appeared to be reluctance. She asks if she may ask a question. Hendricks nodded his permission. She wants to know if this is what life is like in America. She wants to know if all Americans eat hamburgers and drink Coca-Cola and live in abundance like this. She says she was told that America was weak and decadent, but she looks at these supplies and she does not understand how a weak nation could produce such things. It was a significant question, and Hendricks paused before answering. Marcus, listening from his nearby position, understood why. How did you explain America to someone who had been fed nothing but lies about it? How did you describe a nation that was both rich and unequal, both free and segregated, both idealistic and flawed? The simplest answer was not necessarily the truest, but maybe in this moment, the simplest answer was also the most important. Tell her that America is a large and complicated country, Hendricks said finally. Tell her that we have plenty of food and many good things, but we also have problems of our own to solve. Tell her that what she is seeing here is real, but it is not the whole story. Tell her that the men serving her food are American soldiers, and they represent our country as much as anyone else does. Ingrid translated, and the women listened. Marcus could not tell if the answer satisfied them, but it gave them something to think about, which was perhaps the best that could be done in a brief exchange in a mess hall in the middle of a ruined country. Hendricks stood up to move on to another table, but before he left, the blonde woman spoke again. Ingrid translated one last time. She says thank you for the meal. She says it was the best food she has eaten in a very long time. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere in the mess hall continued to evolve. The fear that had been so palpable at the beginning of the meal had not disappeared entirely, but it had loosened, making room for other emotions and interactions. Women who had finished eating began to linger over their empty trays, reluctant to return to the barracks and the uncertainty that awaited them. Some of them talked among themselves in animated clusters, their hands gesturing expressively as they processed the experience they were having. Others sat alone, staring at their empty Coca-Cola bottles, with expressions that seemed almost meditative. Marcus noticed that several women were looking toward the serving line with what appeared to be new eyes. They were not staring with fear now, but with something more like curiosity, even wonder. He realized that for many of them, this was probably the first time they had ever seen black people behaving in ways that contradicted the stereotypes they had absorbed. Here were men in clean uniforms, working efficiently, speaking politely to each other and to the prisoners, showing no signs of the savagery they had been promised. The dissonance between expectation and reality must have been jarring, and Marcus could almost see the mental adjustments happening in real time, as the women struggled to reconcile what they were witnessing with what they had been taught. One woman made the adjustment more explicitly than others. She was sitting alone at a table near the window, having finished her meal some time ago but showing no inclination to leave. She was in her 30s, Marcus guessed, with dark hair and a serious face that bore the traces of old worry. She had been watching the soldiers for nearly an hour, her gaze moving from one man to another as if studying them for an examination. Finally, she stood up, collected her empty tray and Coca-Cola bottle, and walked over to the station where dirty dishes were being collected. Jerome Williams was working at that station. stacking trays and sorting bottles for return to the supply depot. The woman approached him and held out her items with a small bow of her head. "Thank you," she said in careful, heavily accented English. "Thank you very much." Jerome looked surprised, but recovered quickly. "You're welcome, ma'am. I hope you enjoyed your meal." The woman seemed to struggle with her next words, her face working as she searched for the right English phrases. "I want to say, oh," she managed finally, "I am sorry for what I thought before. I was told wrong things. I see now they were lies. I am sorry." It was an extraordinary statement, a direct apology for having believed the racist propaganda of her former government. Jerome stood very still for a moment, clearly moved but uncertain how to respond. Then he reached out and took the tray from her hands with a gentle nod. "Apology accepted, ma'am. We're all just people trying to get through this. No hard feelings." The woman's eyes filled with tears. She started to say something else, seemed to think better of it, and simply nodded before turning and walking away. But Marcus, who had witnessed the entire exchange from a few feet away, saw her wipe her eyes as she went, and he knew that something important had happened. A bridge had been built, a connection made, a small piece of healing accomplished amid all the brokenness of that time and place. The serving line finally closed in the late afternoon after processing nearly 800 prisoners through the mess hall. The soldiers began the work of cleaning up, scrubbing the ranges, washing the serving equipment, breaking down the tables and sweeping the floors. It was hard, unglamorous work, the kind of work that received no medals or commendations, but it was necessary, and the men of the 451st did it with the same efficiency they had brought to every task of the war. As they worked, they talked about the day. There was a lot to discuss. The fear on the women's faces at the beginning, the surprise at the quality of the food, the confusion and curiosity about the black soldiers, the moments of connection, like Jerome's exchange with the woman who apologized. They were all tired, but there was an energy in the conversation that came from having participated in something meaningful, something that mattered beyond the simple logistics of feeding people. Private Hayes summed it up with his characteristic directness. "We showed them," he said, dragging a mop across the floor with powerful strokes. "We showed them that everything they were told was wrong. They thought we were animals, and we gave them hamburgers and cokes and treated them like human beings. That's worth something. That's worth a lot." Corporal Jackson, more analytical by nature, added another dimension. "The question is what happens next," he said. "They learned something today, but will it stick? Will they go home and tell people what they saw? Or will they forget it and go back to what they believed before? One meal doesn't change the world." Marcus considered this as he scrubbed a stubborn spot on one of the field ranges. Jackson was right that one meal did not change the world. But maybe it did not need to. Maybe it was enough to plant a seed, to create a crack in the wall of hate and fear, to give people a different experience that they could set against the lies they had been told. You could not force anyone to change their mind, but you could show them something true and let them wrestle with it. That was what they had done today, and Marcus felt it mattered. He also felt something else, something harder to name but important nonetheless. He felt proud. Not just pride in a job well done, though that was part of it, but a deeper pride in who he was and what he represented. He was a black man from Alabama, son of a furnace worker and a laundress, serving his country in a war against hatred and oppression. He had fed his enemies with dignity and respect, not because they deserved it or had earned it, but because that was the kind of person he chose to be. He had answered hatred with humanity, lies with truth, fear with kindness. In that mess hall today, he had been exactly the man his parents had raised him to be, and he was proud of that. The mess hall fell quiet as the cleaning finished and the soldiers prepared to return to their own quarters for a meal and rest before the next day's duties. Marcus was one of the last to leave, taking a final look around the empty room where so much had happened. The tables were bare now, the chairs stacked, the floors clean and damp. No trace remained of the 800 women who had passed through except in memory. But memory, Marcus thought, was a powerful thing. Those women would carry this day with them, whatever else happened, and so would he. He stepped outside into the late afternoon light and found Sergeant Franklin sitting on an overturned crate, smoking a cigarette and looking thoughtful. Marcus sat down beside him without speaking, content to share a moment of silence. Franklin smoked and Marcus rested, both of them tired in the good way that came from hard work well done. Finally, Franklin spoke, his voice carrying the gravelly warmth that made him a natural leader among the enlisted men. "You know what I kept thinking about today?" he said. "I kept thinking about my granddaddy. He was born a slave, worked in the fields in Mississippi until he was almost 20 before freedom came. He never learned to read, never had anything you could call his own. But he used to tell me that dignity was something nobody could take from you unless you let them. He said you carry it inside and you show it by how you treat people, even people who treat you bad. He said that's how you win in the end." Marcus nodded, understanding. "You think he would have been proud of what we did today?" Franklin took a long drag on his cigarette and let the smoke out slowly. "I think he would have said we did exactly right. We had every reason to be hard and cold with those women. They come from a place that wanted to destroy us, that said we weren't even human. But we fed them good food, and we treated them decent, and we showed them something they never expected to see. That's dignity. That's how you win." The evening meal in the soldiers' mess was more subdued than usual, the men eating quietly and then heading to their bunks early. They were tired, all of them, the kind of tired that comes not just from physical labor but from emotional expenditure. They had given something of themselves today, and they needed to replenish. Marcus lay on his cot as darkness fell, listening to the sounds of the camp settling into night, thinking about the day and what it meant. He thought about the women he had served, their faces passing through his memory like photographs in an album. He thought about their fear and their surprise, and their tentative steps toward understanding. He wondered where they would go from here, what would happen to them in the coming days and weeks and months. Some would go home to families, if they still had families and homes to go to. Others would remain in camps for extended periods, their fates tied to the complicated processes of occupation and reconstruction. All of them would carry the memory of this day, this meal, these soldiers. Marcus hoped it would make a difference in how they saw the world. He thought about his own future too, about what would come after the war ended. He would go home to Birmingham, to a city and a country that would not have changed much in his absence. The same segregation, the same limitations, the same daily indignities would be waiting for him. He had helped defeat one ideology of hate, but another was flourishing in his own homeland. It was a bitter irony, and Marcus did not know how to resolve it. All he could do was keep being the man he wanted to be, keep showing dignity in the face of disrespect, keep hoping that seeds planted would eventually grow. He fell asleep with these thoughts drifting through his mind and dreamed of nothing he could remember. The next several days brought a continuation of the routines established on that first remarkable day. More prisoners arrived, were processed, were fed in the mess hall, and were eventually transferred to other facilities. The 451st Quartermaster Battalion kept the meals coming, kept the supplies flowing, kept the machinery of military logistics turning smoothly. Marcus worked his shifts on the serving line, watching face after face pass before him, seeing the same patterns of fear and surprise and gradual recognition that he had observed on that first day. Word had apparently spread among the prisoners about what to expect from this particular camp and this particular group of soldiers. New arrivals still came in with apprehension, but the worst of the terror had diminished. They had heard from others that the black Americans were not the monsters of propaganda, that the food was good, that treatment was correct. Some arrived almost curious, wanting to see for themselves what their predecessors had described. The atmosphere in the mess hall took on an almost routine quality, as if this extraordinary collision of cultures and histories had become simply another aspect of daily life in a processing camp. But ordinary moments still had the power to surprise. One afternoon, a new group of prisoners included several women who had worked in a German military hospital, nurses and administrative staff who had cared for wounded soldiers. Among them was a woman named Elise Kaufmann, though Marcus would not learn her name until later. She was perhaps 35, with light brown hair and a calm, competent manner that spoke of someone accustomed to handling crises. She moved through the serving line with steady attention, taking her food with brief nods of acknowledgement to each soldier who served her. When she reached the end of the line and received her Coca-Cola from Private Williams, she did something no prisoner had done before. She looked at Jerome directly and asked a question in clear, slightly accented English. "Excuse me, soldier. May I ask where you are from?" Jerome was so surprised that he nearly dropped the bottle he was holding out to her. Conversations between soldiers and prisoners were not forbidden exactly, but they were not encouraged either, and direct questions from prisoners to guards were unusual. Jerome recovered himself and answered, "Chicago, ma'am. I'm from Chicago." Elise nodded as if this was interesting information. "I have heard of Chicago," she said. "It is a large city, yes? There is much industry there." "Yes, ma'am, lots of factories, lots of stockyards. It's a busy place." "And you," Elise continued, "you worked in these factories before the war?" Jerome shook his head. "No, ma'am. I was in school. I was studying to be a teacher. High school mathematics." This information seemed to strike Elise with particular force. She stood very still for a moment, looking at Jerome with an expression that was hard to read. Then she said, quietly but distinctly, "I was also a teacher before. Biology and chemistry. Then the war came, and I became a nurse." It was a moment of connection, a recognition of shared identity across all the barriers that separated them. They were both educated people, both teachers, both caught up in a war that had interrupted their lives and redirected their paths. For just a moment, they were not prisoner and guard, not German and American, not white and black. They were just two people who had wanted to teach young minds and had ended up serving meals and receiving them in a processing camp far from home. Marcus, watching from nearby, saw Jerome's face change. The wariness that always lingered in his eyes when dealing with the prisoners seemed to soften, replaced by something more open, more human. "Maybe after all this is over," Jerome said, "we'll both get back to teaching." "I hope you do, ma'am. The world needs good teachers." Elise's eyes glistened, but she kept her composure. "Thank you," she said. "I hope so also, for both of us." She took her Coca-Cola and moved away to find a seat, but she glanced back once at Jerome before sitting down, a look that carried gratitude and connection and perhaps a measure of hope. That evening, Jerome talked about the encounter in the soldiers' mess, his voice thoughtful and searching. "It's strange, he said. "I know what her people did. I know the evil they were part of, even if she personally never hurt anyone. And I know what my own country does to people who look like me. But in that moment, none of that mattered. She was just a person who wanted to teach, same as me. How do you make sense of that?" It was a question none of them could fully answer, but they tried. They talked about how hate was taught, passed down and reinforced until it felt like natural truth. They talked about how experience could disrupt those teachings, could create cracks in the walls that people built around their minds. They talked about what it might mean for the future if enough of these cracks appeared, if enough seeds were planted, if enough small moments of connection accumulated into something larger. Corporal Jackson, always the thinker of the group, offered a perspective. "We can't change everything," he said. "We can't fix Germany, and we can't fix America, not by ourselves. But we can change what's right in front of us. We can show people something different than what they expect. We can plant seeds, like Marcus said that first day, and then we have to trust that some of those seeds will grow. That's all anybody can do." It was a modest philosophy, but it felt true to Marcus. He had learned long ago that large problems were not solved by grand gestures, but by small actions repeated over time. You could not end racism or rebuild a ruined country in a day, but you could treat the person in front of you with dignity, and then the next person, and then the next. Eventually, if enough people did that, things might begin to change. It was not a guarantee, but it was a hope, and hope was necessary to keep going. The days continued to pass. The war in Europe moved toward its final conclusion, the German military collapsing in the west and east, the remaining leadership making futile attempts to negotiate or escape or simply survive. News reached the camp in fragments, rumors, and reports that painted a picture of imminent end. Marcus and his fellow soldiers knew that their current duties would soon be over. replaced by new assignments in a post-conflict world. They did not know what those assignments would be, whether they would stay in Germany for occupation duty or be sent to the Pacific for the continuing war against Japan. They worked and waited and tried to be ready for whatever came. The mess hall continued to operate, feeding new batches of prisoners as they arrived. Marcus served hundreds more meals, saw hundreds more faces, participated in dozens more small moments of connection and recognition. Some days blurred together in routine sameness, while others brought encounters that stood out and lingered in memory. He came to know the patterns of fear and adaptation that each new group went through, the trajectory from terror to confusion to cautious acceptance. He learned to read the subtle signs of change in a woman's posture or expression, the indicators that she was beginning to see him as a person rather than a threat. He also learned that not everyone changed. Some of the prisoners remained cold and hostile throughout their time in the camp, their hatred of black people so deeply ingrained that no amount of decent treatment could touch it. These women ate the food and drank the Coca-Cola, but refused to acknowledge the humanity of the men who served them, averting their eyes and holding themselves rigid as if contact with black skin would contaminate them. Marcus tried not to let these individuals bother him, but sometimes they did. It was discouraging to do good work and have it rejected, to show dignity and have it ignored. He reminded himself of what Jackson had said about planting seeds and trusting some to grow. You could not force growth, could not make someone change who did not want to. All you could do was offer the opportunity and hope. One afternoon brought an encounter that Marcus would remember for a long time. He was working the serving line when he noticed a woman who seemed somehow familiar, though he could not place her. She was young, early 20s, with light brown hair and an anxious, watchful face. As she approached his station, he realized why he recognized her. She was the woman from the first day, the one who had looked up at him while receiving her hamburger and met his eyes with that desperate, questioning expression. She had passed through the camp once before and had now been returned for some reason, perhaps a paperwork issue or a transfer complication. She was back in the mess hall, moving toward Marcus with her empty tray extended. She recognized him too. He could see it in the slight widening of her eyes, the intake of breath as memory connected present to past. She hesitated for just a moment, then stepped forward and held out her tray for her hamburger. Marcus placed the food on her tray as he had done for thousands of others, but before she could move on, he spoke. "Welcome back," he said. "I hope the food is still good." The woman stared at him. Emotions chased each other across her face, too quick and complex to fully read. Then she answered in careful, halting English. "The food is good," she said. "It is all good. I did not know that people could be like you. I was taught wrong. I know that now." Marcus felt his heart swell with something he could not quite name. "I'm glad you know," he said. "I hope it helps, in whatever comes next." The woman nodded. There were tears in her eyes, but she held them back. "I will tell people," she said. "When I go home, I will tell people what I saw here. I will tell them the truth." She moved on through the line, and Marcus did not see her again. He did not know her name, or where she came from, or where she went after leaving the camp for the second time. But he believed her. He believed she would go home wherever that was, and tell people about the black American soldiers who had fed her hamburgers and Coca-Cola, and treated her with dignity. He believed she would carry that truth with her and share it with others, and that it would make some kind of difference, however small. He believed it because he needed to believe it, because the alternative was to accept that nothing mattered and nothing could change, and he was not willing to accept that. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. The news reached the camp in the evening, and there was celebration among the American soldiers, though it was muted and thoughtful rather than wild. They had accomplished something, been part of something, and now it was over. But for the black soldiers of the 451st, the end of the war in Europe was complicated by the knowledge of what awaited them at home. They had fought for freedom and democracy against an enemy that preached racial superiority, but they were returning to a country that practiced its own forms of racial oppression. It was a contradiction they had lived with throughout the war, and it did not resolve just because the shooting had stopped. The processing camp remained operational for several more weeks, as the flood of prisoners gradually diminished and the transfer system caught up with the backlog. Marcus continued to serve meals, to watch faces, to participate in the daily work of feeding and caring for former enemies. The mood among the prisoners had changed with the war's end. There was grief for many of them, sorrow at the defeat and destruction of their country, anxiety about what the future would hold. But there was also relief that the fighting was over, that no more people would die, that rebuilding could begin. The fear of the Americans had largely disappeared, replaced by a cautious willingness to cooperate and move forward. In early June, the 451st received orders to relocate. They were being sent to another area to help with distribution of supplies for occupation forces and civilian relief. The processing camp at Halle would be turned over to a different unit and eventually closed as the prisoner population declined. It was time to pack up and move on, as soldiers always did, leaving behind the place where so much had happened. The final day at the camp was warm and bright, the kind of early summer day that felt like a promise. Marcus spent the morning loading equipment onto trucks, carrying boxes and crates from buildings he had come to know well over the past 2 months. He took a last walk through the mess hall, empty now and quiet, remembering all the meals served and all the faces seen. It looked smaller and shabbier without the activity that had filled it, just a gymnasium in a teacher's college in a town in Germany. But to Marcus it was more than that. It was a place where he had done something good, where he had been part of something that mattered. He would not forget it. As the convoy formed up for departure, Marcus found himself standing next to Sergeant Franklin, both of them taking a last look at the camp that had been their home. Franklin had a cigar clamped in his teeth, unlit but serving its purpose as a prop for thought. "Think it made a difference?" Franklin asked, gesturing vaguely at the buildings and the grounds and the gates. "All those meals, all those conversations, all those women we fed, think any of it mattered in the end?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "I think it mattered to the people it happened to," he said. "Those women saw something they didn't expect. They learned that what they'd been told was wrong. Maybe some of them will forget or go back to what they believed before. But some of them will remember. Some of them will tell others. And maybe that changes something down the line. I don't know if we can ask for more than that." Franklin nodded slowly. "I guess we can't," he said. "We do what we can, where we are, and then we move on. That's the soldier's life." He finally lit his cigar, puffed it into life, and grinned around it. "But I'll tell you one thing. We made damn good hamburgers. Best hamburgers any of those women ever tasted. That's something to be proud of." Marcus laughed, feeling the tension of departure ease slightly. "Yes, Sergeant, that's definitely something to be proud of." The convoy rolled out in the early afternoon, a long line of trucks carrying the men and equipment of the 451st to their next assignment. Marcus sat in the back of one of the transport trucks, watching the German countryside pass by, the green fields and small villages and occasional ruins that marked the passage of war. He thought about everything he had seen and done since arriving in Europe, the long journey from the beaches of France to this moment, on a road leading away from a processing camp near Halle. It had been a journey full of contradictions and complications, pride and frustration, hope and disappointment. But he had come through it, and he was still himself, still the man his parents had raised, still carrying the dignity that nobody could take away. He thought about the women he had served, scattered now to whatever destinations awaited them, carrying their memories of Hamburgers and Coca-Cola, and black American soldiers who had treated them with unexpected humanity. He hoped those memories would grow into something, would contribute to a different future than the past that had produced so much hate and destruction. He would never know for certain. The seeds were planted, and now they would either grow or not, beyond his ability to control or even to see. But he had done his part, and he could live with that. The truck bounced along the road, carrying Marcus toward whatever came next. He did not know what that would be, whether more duty in Europe or transfer to the Pacific, or eventually the long trip home to Birmingham. He did not know what he would find when he got there, what opportunities or obstacles would greet a black veteran returning from war. He only knew that he would face it all the same way he had faced everything else, with dignity and determination and the hope that things could get better if people worked to make them so. The afternoon sun slanted through the canvas cover of the truck, casting stripes of light across the faces of the men sitting along the benches. They were quiet, most of them, lost in their own thoughts as they left one chapter behind and moved toward another. Marcus let his eyes close, feeling the rhythm of the road beneath him, and allowed himself to rest. When he opened his eyes again, the landscape had changed. They were passing through a town, buildings rising on either side, people in the streets going about their business. Some of them stopped to watch the convoy pass, their expressions unreadable. Germans watching American trucks, former enemies now living under occupation. It was strange, and it was real, and it was the world they all had to live in now. Marcus saw a woman standing on a corner, holding a child's hand, watching the trucks with an expression that might have been anything. He wondered if she had ever been in a processing camp, ever been served a meal by a black American soldier, ever had her assumptions challenged by an unexpected experience of humanity. He would never know. She was just a woman on a corner in a town in Germany, watching military trucks pass by on a June afternoon. But she was also a symbol of all the people who would shape the future, all the minds that might or might not change, all the seeds that might or might not grow. The truck moved on, leaving the town behind, returning to open countryside. Marcus settled back against the bench and watched the sky through the gap in the canvas, blue and endless. The same sky that covered Alabama and Illinois and Pennsylvania, and all the places the men around him called home. They were a long way from those places now, but they carried them inside, in memory and hope and determination. And one day, they would return. The convoy continued on its way, carrying the soldiers of the 451st toward their next mission, their next challenge, their next opportunity to do something good in a complicated world. The road stretched ahead, unknown and open, waiting to see what they would make of it. The weeks following the departure from Halle brought new landscapes and new duties, but the memories of the processing camp traveled with Marcus like a companion he could not leave behind. The 451st was assigned to a supply depot near the city of Mannheim, a major distribution point for the food and materials flowing into occupied Germany. The work was familiar, the same rhythms of inventory and loading and transportation that had defined their service since arriving in Europe, but the context had shifted. They were no longer supporting an advancing army, but an occupation force, no longer feeding prisoners but helping to sustain a civilian population that had been left devastated by years of conflict. The depot at Mannheim was larger and busier than anything Marcus had experienced before, a sprawling complex of warehouses and rail sidings, where supplies arrived from ports and airfields and were sorted for distribution across the American zone of occupation. Trains came and went at all hours, loaded with canned goods and flour and powdered milk and 1,000 other necessities of survival. Trucks lined up in long columns to receive their cargoes and carry them to cities and towns where hungry people waited. It was a massive logistical operation, and the men of the 451st were part of it, keeping the machinery running, making sure the supplies reached the people who needed them. Marcus found the work satisfying in a different way than the mess hall had been. There was less direct human contact, fewer individual faces to see and remember, but there was a clear sense of purpose in knowing that the crates he loaded and the trucks he dispatched were bringing food to families who might otherwise go hungry. Germany was in a state of severe deprivation, its infrastructure destroyed, its economy collapsed, its people struggling to survive amid the rubble. The occupying armies were responsible for feeding millions of civilians, a task that required enormous resources and constant effort. Marcus understood that he was part of something important, even if he never saw the ultimate recipients of his work. He thought often about the women from the processing camp and what their lives must be like now. Many of them had probably returned to cities that barely existed anymore, to homes that had been bombed or burned, to families that were scattered or lost. They were part of the hungry population that the supply convoys were trying to reach. Perhaps some of them had received food that Marcus had helped to distribute, cans and packages that had passed through his hands on their way from depot to table. The thought gave him a sense of connection, a feeling that his work at Halle and his work at Mannheim were part of the same larger purpose. The summer of 1945 passed in hard work and gradual adjustment. The news from the Pacific grew more intense as the war against Japan moved toward its climax, and there was talk among the soldiers about where they might be sent next. Some expected to be transferred to the Pacific Theater for the anticipated invasion of Japan, a prospect that filled no one with enthusiasm. Others hoped for demobilization and return to the United States now that the war in Europe was over. The Army's point system for determining discharge priority was a constant topic of conversation, with men calculating their scores based on months of service, overseas time, combat decorations, and other factors. Marcus had a respectable total, but not enough for early release. He expected to remain in the Army for at least another year. Then came August, and the news that changed everything. First one atomic bomb on a Japanese city, then another, and then Japan's surrender. The war was over. The global conflict that had consumed the world for 6 years had finally ended, and the task of rebuilding could begin in earnest. There was celebration among the soldiers, of course, relief and joy that the fighting was done and no more lives would be lost. But there was also a sense of strangeness, of uncertainty about what would come next. They had been soldiers for so long, defined by military structure and purpose, and now that structure and purpose were shifting beneath them. For the black soldiers, the end of the war brought particular questions and anxieties. They had served their country loyally and well, had done every job they were given with skill and dedication, had proven themselves equal to any challenge. But they knew that America did not reward black service the way it rewarded white service, that they would return to a nation still deeply segregated and unequal. They had helped defeat fascism abroad, but they faced their own form of oppression at home. It was a bitter reality that tempered any celebration with wariness and determination. The autumn brought changes to the 451st. Some men received discharges and went home, their points accumulated to the threshold required for release. Others were transferred to different units, as the Army reorganized for its occupation duties. New men arrived to replace those who left, changing the composition of the battalion and the dynamics of daily life. Marcus remained, his point total not yet sufficient for discharge, his skills in supply operations still needed by the Army. He found himself thinking more and more about what he would do when he finally went home. Before the war, he had vague aspirations toward college, toward some kind of professional career, though the details had never been clear. Now he had years of experience in logistics and organization, practical skills that might translate to civilian work. He also had a new sense of himself, of what he was capable of and what he could accomplish. He had fed former enemies and changed minds and planted seeds. He had been part of something important. He wanted to continue being part of important things. He also thought about the larger struggle that awaited black Americans in the post-war era. There was talk of change coming, of the contradictions between American ideals and American practices becoming too obvious to ignore. Black soldiers had served with distinction and returned home expecting better treatment than their fathers had received after the previous war. Organizations were pushing for civil rights, for an end to segregation, for the full citizenship that the Constitution promised, but the nation had never delivered. Marcus did not know what role he might play in that struggle, but he knew he wanted to be part of it. He had learned in Germany that dignity could be shown through everyday actions, that small moments of humanity could accumulate into larger change. Maybe that was how the struggle at home would be won too. One interaction at a time, one mind at a time, one seed at a time. Winter came to Mannheim cold and grey, the depot continuing its work despite the weather. Marcus wore extra layers and stamped his feet to keep warm as he supervised loading operations and managed inventory. The routine had become familiar, almost comfortable, a known quantity in an uncertain time. He had made friends among the newer men in the battalion, had found his place in the social structure of the unit, had settled into a pattern that he could sustain indefinitely if required. But he also felt restless, eager for the next chapter to begin. He was ready to go home, ready to see his family, ready to start building whatever civilian life awaited him. The Army was good enough, the work was meaningful enough, but it was not his future. His future was in America, in Birmingham or somewhere else, doing something that mattered. He just had to be patient and wait for the army to let him go. The waiting finally ended in the spring of 1946, nearly a year after the war in Europe had ended. Marcus received orders for discharge, his accumulated points finally reaching the threshold, his service in the army coming to a close. He processed out through a separation center, turned in his equipment, received his final pay and his discharge papers, and became a civilian again after more than 4 years in uniform. He shipped home across the Atlantic on a crowded transport, standing at the rail as the ship pulled away from Europe and watching the coastline fade into distance and mist. He was going back to a country he had left as a young man and was returning to as something different, something harder to define. He had seen things and done things and learned things that would stay with him forever. He had been changed by the war, as everyone who lived through it had been changed, and he was curious to discover what that meant for his life ahead. The ship docked in Virginia, and Marcus took a train south to Alabama, watching America roll past the window, familiar and strange at the same time. He saw segregated facilities at every station, reminders that the country he had served was still divided along color lines that seemed absurd after everything he had experienced. He saw black travelers directed to separate waiting rooms and separate cars, treated as lesser citizens in the nation they had helped to defend. It made him angry and sad and determined in roughly equal measure. Birmingham was the same and not the same. The streets of his old neighborhood were as he remembered them, the houses and the shops and the churches where his life had taken shape. But he saw them with different eyes now, saw the limitations and the injustices that he had once accepted as simply the way things were. He saw his parents, older and grayer, proud of their son, but worried about his prospects. He saw his siblings, growing up in the same narrow circumstances that he had known, their futures constrained by the same barriers. He saw a world that needed changing, and he felt within himself the will to change it. He also saw signs of hope, glimmers of the change that was beginning to stir across the South and the nation. He heard about returning veterans demanding better treatment, about organizations filing lawsuits against segregation, about a new generation unwilling to accept the old humiliations. The struggle would be long and hard, he understood that, but it was beginning, and he could be part of it. Marcus found work at one of the industrial plants in the city, using the logistical skills he had developed in the army to manage warehouse operations and supply chains. It was good work, decent pay, enough to live on and save a little for the future. He also enrolled in evening classes at a black college, working toward a degree he had not been able to pursue before the war. He was 26 years old and just getting started, later than some, but with more experience than most. He was patient, determined, and unafraid. On weekends sometimes, he would sit on the porch of his parents' house and tell stories about the war. His family would gather around, his mother and father and siblings, listening to tales of France and Belgium and Germany, of supply depots and transport convoys and mess halls. He told them about the processing camp near Halle, about the German women who came in terrified and left changed, about the Hamburgers and Coca-Cola that became bridges across chasms of hate and fear. His family listened with wonder and pride, amazed that their Marcus had been part of such things. One evening his younger sister asked him what it had felt like, serving food to people who thought he was less than human. Marcus considered the question carefully, wanting to give an honest answer. "It felt important," he said finally. "It felt like I was showing them something they needed to see. They had all these ideas about what black people were like, and I got to show them the truth. I got to show them dignity, and some of them learned from it. I could see them learning. That felt like winning something, even though it wasn't a battle." His sister nodded, taking this in. "Do you think it made a difference?" she asked. "Do you think those women changed because of what you did?" Marcus smiled, thinking of the woman who had apologized to Jerome, the woman who had promised to tell the truth when she got home, all the faces that had softened and opened over the course of a meal. "I think some of them did," he said. "I think some of them are different now because of what happened at that camp, and maybe they'll raise their children different. And those children will raise their children different, and eventually things will change. That's how it works. You plant seeds, and you trust that some of them will grow. He looked out at the neighborhood, at the modest houses and the unpaved streets, at all the evidence of inequality and limited opportunity. "That's what we have to do here too," he said. "We have to plant seeds. We have to show people the truth and trust that some of them will learn from it. It won't happen fast. It'll take a long time and a lot of work. But it can happen. I've seen it happen." His sister looked at him with something like wonder. "You really believe that?" she asked. "After everything, you really believe things can change?" Marcus thought about Sergeant Franklin and his granddaddy's lesson about dignity. He thought about Corporal Jackson and his philosophy of changing what was right in front of you. He thought about all the small moments at the processing camp that had accumulated into something meaningful, all the cracks that had formed in the walls of hate. "I believe it because I've seen it," he said. "I know it's possible because I've watched it happen. That doesn't mean it's easy or guaranteed, but it's possible. And if it's possible, then it's worth working for." The years that followed brought the changes Marcus had anticipated, slowly and with great struggle. The civil rights movement gathered force, challenging segregation through courts and protests, and the steady insistence that America live up to its stated ideals. There were victories and setbacks, hope and heartbreak, progress and backlash. Marcus was part of it in his own way, not as a leader or a famous figure, but as someone who lived the struggle daily, who insisted on his dignity in every interaction, who planted seeds wherever he could, and trusted some of them to grow. He finished his degree and became a teacher, returning to the same Birmingham neighborhood where he had grown up and dedicating himself to preparing the next generation. He married a woman named Dorothy, a nurse he met at a church social, and they raised 3 children together, a son and 2 daughters, who would have opportunities their parents had never known. He became active in his community, serving on boards and committees, helping to register voters and organize boycotts, doing the unglamorous work that built movements from the ground up. He never forgot the lessons of that mess hall in Germany. He told the story to his children and eventually to his grandchildren, wanted them to understand what he had learned about hate and fear and the possibility of change. He told them that people could learn, that walls could crack, that seeds could grow. He told them that dignity was something you carried inside and showed through how you treated people, even people who treated you badly. He told them that was how you won in the end. The women from the processing camp faded into memory, nameless faces in a vast flow of history. Marcus never knew what happened to most of them, whether they carried their experience forward and let it shape their lives and their families. He hoped they did. He hoped the ones who had promised to tell the truth had kept their promises, had raised children with different beliefs than they themselves had been raised with, had contributed to a Germany that was working to overcome its terrible past. He would never know for certain, but he chose to believe it was so. One story he did eventually learn many years later came to him through an unexpected channel. A journalist from a German newspaper was writing about post-war reconciliation, about the ways that former enemies had found common ground in the years after the conflict. He had somehow discovered the story of the mess hall, and the black soldiers and the German women had tracked down veterans from the 451st and had eventually found Marcus. They talked for hours, Marcus sharing memories he had not spoken of in years, the journalist recording everything with evident fascination. The journalist told Marcus something he had not known, something that touched him deeply. He said that there were women in Germany who still talked about that processing camp, who had told their children and grandchildren about the black American soldiers who had fed them hamburgers and Coca-Cola and treated them with dignity. He said it had become something of a legend in certain circles, a story passed down through families as an example of unexpected humanity in a time of hatred and fear. He said that some of those families had become active in anti-racism work, inspired by the example of the soldiers who had shown them the truth about prejudice and propaganda. Marcus listened to this with tears in his eyes, overcome by the knowledge that the seeds he had planted had indeed grown. The work of that mess hall had rippled outward through decades and generations, had shaped minds and hearts and lives in ways he had never imagined. The simple act of serving food with dignity had become a legend, a teaching story, a testament to the power of humanity in the face of hate. "I always hoped it made a difference," he told the journalist. "I always believed it could, but I never knew for sure. Thank you for telling me this. It means more than I can say." The journalist asked Marcus what lesson he would draw from his experience, what he would want people to understand about that time and place and those extraordinary meals. Marcus thought carefully before answering. "The lesson is that people can change," he said. "They can learn. They can see the truth when it's shown to them, even if it contradicts everything they've been taught. Hate is powerful, but it's not invincible. It can be cracked by simple acts of humanity. That's what I saw in that mess hall, and that's what I've seen in all the years since. People can change if you give them the chance and show them the way." He paused, then added one more thought. "And the other lesson is that dignity is power. When you treat people with dignity, even people who don't treat you well, you win something. You show them what's possible. You plant a seed, and some of those seeds will grow." The journalist thanked Marcus for his time and his memories, and promised to send him a copy of the article when it was published. They shook hands, two men from very different backgrounds, connected by a story that had crossed oceans and decades to bring them together. After the journalist left, Marcus sat for a long time in his living room, thinking about the journey that had brought him from a Birmingham neighborhood to a processing camp in Germany and back again. He thought about all the faces he had served in that mess hall, all the moments of fear and surprise and recognition. He thought about the lessons he had learned and the seeds he had planted and the changes he had witnessed. He thought about his children and grandchildren and the world they were inheriting, a world still full of problems but also full of possibilities. He thought about hamburgers and Coca-Cola, simple things that had carried such weight in that specific time and place, food that represented abundance and culture and a way of life, food that had been served by men whom the recipients had been taught to fear and despise, food that had become a bridge, a crack in the wall, a seed in the ground. Ordinary things made extraordinary by context and meaning. Marcus smiled, feeling the peace that came from a life well lived. He had done his part. He had shown dignity and planted seeds and trusted that some would grow. And they had grown. They were still growing in Germany and America and everywhere that people struggled to overcome hate and find their common humanity. That was his legacy. That was what he would leave behind. Not grand achievements or famous deeds, but small moments accumulated over a lifetime, each one a testimony to the power of treating people right. That was enough. That was everything. The afternoon light slanted through the windows of his living room, warm and golden, carrying him back for just a moment to another afternoon in another place, when he was young and the world was broken and he had the chance to help put one small piece of it back together. He had taken that chance. He had served hamburgers and Coca-Cola to women who feared him, and he had shown them there was nothing to fear. He had changed minds and hearts, had contributed to a different future than the past would have predicted. And that was something to be proud of. That was something to be very proud of. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.